Welcome to the first edition of the California Association of Realtors podcast, Unlocking California Politics. My name is Sanjay Wagle, Senior Vice President for Governmental Affairs for the California Association of Realtors. The first episode is focused on the California recall election. The election will be held on September 14th. The ballot will have basically two parts. The first, a question on whether or not Governor Newsom should be recalled. And second, a list of candidates for whom voters can vote for to replace him should he actually be recalled. Today with us to discuss the upcoming election and all of the politics around the recall, we have Democratic consultant Josh Pulliam and Republican political consultant Mike Madrid. Before we begin our discussion, I think it is obvious why this topic is of such interest to our members. Realtors tend to be politically involved, reflecting their involvement in the communities in which they work. Their work makes them acutely aware of issues directly connected to housing, such as affordability and supply issues, home insurance, fair housing, and taxes, but also those such as educational quality and other quality of life issues. Our membership, reflecting the diversity of California's communities, reflects its political diversity as well, with members who support Gavin Newsom, who are undecided, and who actually support the recall. So Mike and Josh, first question is, what is fueling the recall now? And I'll start with you, Mike.
Sure. I mean, look, it's a great question. It's the question of the day. The main issue is I think that there's a real gap between what is happening with the governance of the state and the way what we call the mood of the electorate is moving. I think a lot of people feel that the handling of the pandemic specifically hasn't been as competent as they would probably have liked. Some of that, of course, is unfair criticism. This is a once in a century event. So it's kind of hard to hold somebody to a certain standard, hold the governor to a certain standard when it's really unprecedented, or at least, again, haven't seen in a century. But that was really what catalyzed this entire, recall fever. It's not uncommon to have recalls on the ground, as we say. There's almost always a petition circulating for every governor at any moment in time, trying to gather signatures to recall somebody. Any gadfly can kind of pull one for $200 and start the circulation process. Oftentimes, though, they will kind of catch fire if the right things line up, and that usually depends on something like a once-in-a-century pandemic or the lights going out, for example, with Gray Davis. But look, we'll get into this a little bit too, but Governor Newsom's approval ratings still remain relatively high. The fundamentals are still pretty good. But the competence in terms of running the government is where that gap exists, where there's a lack of, I think, confidence in the ability to handle some of these larger situations. That's what catalyzed the recall. That's what allowed it to gather signatures that needed, and that's why we're going to be looking at this question in September.
Thanks, Mike. Josh?
As Mike mentioned, recalls happen often, but most often they're not actually qualified and get enough signatures. This is either the fifth or the sixth attempt to recall Gavin Newsom in his very short tenure in office. And what was circulated in terms of the grounds for this recall and I'm quoting as follows: Gavin Newsom has implemented laws which are detrimental to the citizens of the state and our way of life. Laws endorsed favor foreign nationals in our country illegally over that of our own citizens. And then they kind of go along and bring up immigration laws again later. So as Mike mentioned, what's really gathered a lot of steam was the pandemic. Gavin Newsom obviously inherited a lot of systematic and decades in the making problems, whether it be wildfires, energy problems, the drought, and of course, a real crisis in homelessness and a housing shortage. So I think all of these combined, and then you add the pandemic on top of it, plus Trump's loss, I think really made it so that there was a small group of Californians who were really galvanized and looking for the next crusade, and found this and were sort of fortunate that the stars aligned where they were able to con enough voters to sign their name on it, taking advantage of, as Mike mentioned, some of these gaps and some of these other issues. But in terms of what fueled it at the beginning, what was behind it and the funders, it was very similar to 2013, where Darrell Issa funded it. This case, it was a few more folks than that, but it was really trying to take advantage of the system to weaponize where these Republicans can't win statewide office in California. So they're using the recall process in an attempt to do so.
Okay. How is this recall? You both mentioned the previous recall. How does this differ from that recall effort, the one that swept Arnold Schwarzenegger to victory last time? Mike.
I think it's a completely different scenario. I think it's entirely different. The first is it's an entirely different state demographically. The rise of Democratic registrations has exploded while the decline of Republicans has kind of fallen off of a cliff. We have to remember this was almost 20 years ago. We're looking at basically 2 redistrictings that will happen essentially in that same time frame. And California has become an extremely blue state, probably one of the standard bearers of blue states in the country. And you also have a different issues matrix. It's not just demographic, although that's a very big part of it. You have to remember when Gray Davis was recalled, we were not only experiencing rolling blackouts, he had just signed into law one of the most unpopular car tax increases in history.
I remember that.
And he also, his own personal style, I think, left him, vulnerable politically to a number of the prevailing political winds that were circulating at the time. So I think there's very few comparisons. We're in this era right now where there's a lot of people who were doing the recall race 20 years ago, trying to draw these comparisons and kind of relive the glory days. It's very, very hard for me to see any correlations between the two of them. I do think that there is something to what Josh is saying, which is the hyper-partisan environment, which is also very different, has allowed for a smaller cadre of Republicans who will sign basically anything, any document that is, anti-democratic to qualify anything on the ballot, puts us in an environment where qualifying recalls is going to become more common in the future, not less.
Interesting.
And I think that that's probably one of the things that did also help propel this to put this on the ballot. But I think in terms of politically, this couldn't be a more different scenario. These are just 2 very different election contests.
Thank you. Josh?
Yeah, different in so many ways. I agree with Mike, even from the fact that this previous recall in 2003 was on the ballot less than a year after Gray Davis was reelected. He was reelected in early November of 2022, and the recall ballot was October 7th, 2003. So it was at the beginning stage of, albeit his second term. Whereas here, if Governor Newsom is recalled, then he would basically be recalled about a year away from the next general election, which I do find, of course, ironic that here the Republican Party that touts itself as the taxpayer advocate party is spending so much money in taxpayer dollars for recall when, if you want to take somebody out of office, go the Democratic route, try to take him out of the office like any other part of our democracy when he's up for re-election, which is only a year from now. The other, I think, differences too, as Mike pointed out, are the demographic changes. And I pulled up a couple of numbers just to share with folks. So at the time, back in 2003, there were the most recent Secretary of State report right before the recall, 43% of the state, 43.6% of the state was Democrat, registered Democrat, 6.7 million Democrats, 35.3% Republican, 5.4 million Republicans, and about 16% declined to state, and then a few handful of sort of third party. That's about 2.4 million. So right now, 46.4%, so about a 3% uptick in Democrats, but that translates to nearly 4 million more Democrats. There's well over 10 million registered Democrats. On Republicans, not only have they nosedived in terms of the percentages, they don't make up 35% of the electorate. Now they make up about 24%, but 5.3 million registered Republicans, 5.3 million registered Republicans, right? So that's more than 1 million fewer registered Republicans 20 years later, 17 years later than there were back in 2003. That's remarkable, especially considering the fact that at the time there were 15 to 16 million registered voters in California in 2003, and now there's over 22 million registered voters in California. So here we have 6 to 7 million more registered voters, and yet the Republican Party is dropped in terms of the sheer quantity. And of course, there's been a big uptick in the independent decline to state. especially in the last 5 or 8 years. Many Californians want to see more of a middle centrist, folks that can work together and get things done, and sort of turned off by both parties. But a lot of those folks in the Republican Party have been turned off by Trump, turned off by all this type of extremism, and that's why their numbers are dwindling, where we have more folks who are independent and nonpartisan in California than we do Republican. So, that is a vast difference. And just looking at the amount of Democratic voters we have who have voted in 3 of the last 4 elections. So you take the last 2 primaries and the last 2 generals. We have 4.5 million Democrats have voted in those elections. And we look at 2 of 2 the Democratic voters who voted 2 out of the last 2 elections, primary and general, 4.8 million. So it's really, for Gavin Newsom, just going to be a matter of turnout and GOTV and just getting these Democrats who are a lot more emboldened to vote and are participating a lot more than they were back in 2003. Because frankly, as Mike pointed out, Gray Davis didn't give folks a lot to be excited about. He had a tough re-election in 2002. Gavin Newsom won easily. He trounced John Cox. So much so in terms of Gray Davis's challenge that they engaged in the Republican primary to try to pick their candidate because they were fearful that if they had Reardon, more moderate Republican, that Gray Davis very well may lose. So, I think there's many different dynamics between the two. And also, as Mike said, the only common ground here is that it's basically using this sort of weaponization of the recall for the party that can't win this general election in terms of putting a Republican in the general in the governor's seat.
Real quick, to put some of this in perspective, some of the numbers that Josh was saying is, you've essentially seen the Democratic Party increase since 2003 by about 4.5 million voters. There are only 5.5 million Republicans in the entire state now, 20 years later.
Right.
So Democrats have added almost as many voters, just added new voters, raw voters, as there are the entirety of the Republican Party in 20 years. And so when we're both talking about demographic changes, it's not just racial and ethnic composition that we're talking about, although that's been significant. The partisan construct of the state has been completely revamped. It's just a completely different state.
You both mentioned the hyperpartisanship and the weaponizing of the recall process. One thing I think which is interesting compared to the last recall is, in that case, though, you did have running in Schwarzenegger, a sort of almost a bipartisan Republican, somebody who appealed to everyone. One of the things which I think is curious about this is, do you think the hopes of the people who backed the initiative was that a candidate would emerge, or just that Newsom would be unpopular enough? Because this seems to be one of the bigger differences, is that you don't have a candidate who might have that cross-party appeal. What do you think the backers were thinking in terms of a candidate, or did they just think Newsom will be so unpopular we don't have to worry about this?
I would assume that they weren't thinking anything and hadn't thought that far ahead. Again, since this was the 5th or 6th time they tried. I would love Mike's thoughts though on what potential candidate that they thought might emerge. Maybe they thought Caitlyn Jenner would get a lot of fire. I kind of doubt that, but what do you think?
Well, look, I think that there was no forethought. I think what Josh said is this was kind of lightning in a bottle.
Okay.
There was no planning that was like, hey, this is the candidate that we should back, or this is something that we ought to be looking towards. We are in an era of what we call negative partisanship. Negative partisanship is basically the concept that we are against more than what we are for. And so just being against Gavin Newsom was really the only driving fuel that was getting this thing forward. So there was no thought beyond that. And that leaves them in a position where they're at right now, which is there's 4 or 5 different candidates that are sort of spreading the Republican base, as small as it is, thin. And there's about as many undecided voters who have no idea who these candidates are as the top vote getter in most of the public opinion polling at this point in time. So it puts them in a rather precarious position, and it does, I think, it's a sign that before you endeavor into these things, it might be wise to at least have some sort of a plan, or at least some sort of a concept When the recall against Gray Davis started, and again, that recall started too without much forethought. Like we said, there's always these recall efforts going. Some of them just happen to catch fire, and when they do, they will find the resources or the money to get these things qualified. Same thing happened with Gray Davis in 2003. The difference was you had a candidate like Schwarzenegger in the wings.
Right.
And say what you will about his politics, this was a studied, well-versed individual who had committed many years of his life to making sure that he was positioned to run for governor, because he would have in the normally scheduled election if there was not a recall. He'd already backed up a successful statewide ballot measure, for example. So this is an entirely different scenario. This was really, I think, about just a lot of the angst and stern of the Republican base, as Josh was pointing out earlier, where they were just so pissed and so angry and so full of fire and vinegar that they just wanted to take out their anger somewhere, and it manifests itself in a recall.
Okay, so again, both of you have mentioned the issue of the hyperpartisanship and the motivations behind that. So do you think in large part that might be why these movements aren't able to capture what is kind of a disgruntlement in this pandemic era, that they're not able to capture that more because they're seen as being hyperpartisan rather than some sort of more,
it's not just hyperpartisanship, although that's true. The idea is it's negative partisanship, which means I'm more concerned about why I'm not a Democrat if I'm a Republican, or I'm not a Republican if I'm a Democrat, than I am about what my own party stands for.
Okay.
I'm more interested and motivated as a voter by being opposed to a party, as opposed to saying, oh, I believe lock, stock, and barrel everything that my party believes. So in that type of an environment, it makes it impossible to seek compromise. And when you have a media bubble, as Josh was pointing out, that feeds that has monetized that, you end up with, America in this year at this time, which is there's no compromise. There's very few, if any, undecideds. And it's also why I think the math becomes very difficult for challengers in a recall election to get that many Democrats that will be required to actually vote against Gavin Newsom in a recall. Is even though I may not like Gavin Newsom, I may not support everything that he's done as governor, I may think he's even a bad governor, but he's not as bad as the Trump-like Republicans that will win and take over if he is recalled. That type of sentiment is what will ultimately bring the vast majority of Democrats back into the fold.
Right, and I think that goes back to my earlier question about not having a candidate, which makes sense because it's more the opposition.
It's not about what we stand for; it's what we stand against.
Interesting.
And not having a candidate in Schwarzenegger, where I don't know that there was necessarily a grand plan to draft Schwarzenegger. Obviously, he was waiting in the wings. As I mentioned earlier, Darrell Issa funded a lot of that. He himself thought, I think, he would be governor, but he frankly was punished by voters for funding it. Whereas Schwarzenegger came out and ran this sort of blow up the boxes, similar in a sense to what some of the things that Trump said and what people sort of thought maybe Trump was going to be the sort of anti-politician, and that coupled with a lot of folks being really upset with Gray Davis created a perfect storm. I actually don't think that Schwarzenegger could have won a regular election, and a true vetting process where you have 6-9 months, a year and a half. He just had such a bad record, but I think even he would have been, had a really tough time winning against another challenger for an open seat. Obviously he did well in his re-election not too long after that, but at the end of the day, he was kind of all over the place on a lot of the issues, and maybe did some good work on the environment, but really came out and went after unions and created a whole special election where he tried to take away union power and really galvanized folks and really showed voters that he really actually had this other kind of crazy agenda too. Whereas in the shortened timeline of the recall, and because of his celebrity, he was able to just sort of be seen as somebody who was sort of an anti-politician at a time when they saw Gray Davis as a career politician who wasn't looking out for them.
So what is Governor Newsom doing right in order to try to to get people to vote no on the recall? Mike?
Well, the main thing that he's doing right is he's trying to make this a partisan race because of the dynamics that we're talking about. There is no stronger indicator about how people are going to vote than based off of your party registration. And even in an era of growing no party preference or decline to state affiliation, independents as we call them, that are increasing, we still know demographically that by about 2-1, people are still voting, independents are voting for Democrats in California. So making this a partisan grab, and you're hearing a lot of that in the media and from Gavin Newsom and his campaign and from Democrats up and down the state. This is all about Trump. It's all about Republicans. It's all about the right wingers. It's all about extremism. That's going to be you're going to hear that until the cows come home from now through September, because that's the best hope that Gavin Newsom has. He's done that quite effectively. I think he's probably done it to the detriment of arguing his own case, especially early on. And now we're in the last few weeks of this thing. That's probably all you're going to hear, unfortunately. But the reality is that that type of tactic is most likely to work.
Okay.
Yeah, it certainly seems like it's working, and with the Democratic Party and others, especially coming on the heels of 4 years of Donald Trump in California, and where he's literally attacking California and Californians, and wasn't helping us with wildfires and other issues. Meanwhile, sending money to places like Texas and Florida, and all the other very terrible things in terms of policy and rhetoric. It's really sort of perfect timing for Gavin Newsom and Democrats to say, are you kidding? This, call it what it is, which is this Republican Trump, supporters power grab. I think the other aspect that he's actually doing really well, because a lot of that is coming from the Democratic Party and from surrogates, and certainly he's pushing that. But at the same time, I think he's doing a really good job of going up and down the state and managing all of these crises that are happening in the state. He's dealing with the pandemic. We've got wildfires, as we mentioned, homelessness, and getting our schools back open and having kids be able to have in-class learning. He's been extremely busy, and I think really focused on that really for the last year through this signature gathering process. And even through the sort of qualification of the signature process, he didn't immediately go into sort of campaign mode, which I think was really smart, because then he doesn't look like a candidate. He looks like the adult in the room who's really looking out for what's best for all Californians. And, whether you sort of agree or disagree with some of the policy issues, they have been very innovative and very forward thinking, and, trying to find new solutions and new energy to some of these old systematic problems. So in that sense, I think he's also doing a really good job of trying to make the focus, we've got really big problems and I'm equipped to run the state, and, I'm just getting started here. Meanwhile, he, to a lesser extent, and I'm sure it's going to kick into fifth gear there in the last month, even stronger on the recall for the Republican side. But, meanwhile, in the Democratic Party and surrogates are really branding this, which they've been able to do pretty easily because it is what it is.
Okay, that's actually a very good point, because that's something I had been thinking about, is why so much of the focus, not as much on the record, it felt like, in terms of the advertising, and more on the fact that it's on the Republican focus. So it really is to motivate that Democratic base to come out, which is very large in California.
Yeah, with the numbers of Democrats, if you're able to keep your base, he's going to be just fine. Okay. I think it does beg a broader question, though, right? Which is, if you're not running on your record, there's probably a reason why. I mean, look, there is concern out there. Let's just be honest about that. We have to acknowledge this has not been a great first term as governor of California. Most of the problems that were promised to be addressed, housing, especially for your members, has gotten worse. Homelessness is worse. Crime is on the rise. Our public school system is not doing well at all. There's a whole host of problems that have not been ameliorated. They've not even begun to be addressed. And I think that probably more than anything is where the governor really needed to focus early on, as this recall was becoming real, was to start focusing and start acknowledging some of that and saying, look, we're going through some tough times. We're dealing with a once in a century pandemic. It's put a pause on the agenda, but here's what I'm doing. Let's stay the course. Let's make sure that this works. We didn't hear any of that. We didn't hear any of that. What we heard immediately was this retrenchment back to the partisanship, which, again, tactically, in all likelihood, will probably work, but it still makes his problem as a governor more difficult the day after the election, because he hasn't begun to address some of those problems.
And I think that dynamic could be, too, why we've seen in the last few weeks some of the polling tighten up. When you look at these polls and they're polling registered voters, he runs away with it, and overwhelmingly Californians oppose the recall. But when pollsters are getting folks on the phone or online, they're screening to filter through who are the registered voters who say they are going to vote. And there is much more passion and vitriol and pitchforkness from the Republicans. So they say they're basically opting into the polls, saying that they're going to be voting because they're very motivated to do so. Whereas Democrats still, a lot of them don't exactly know when the election is. You know, I heard about the recall. When is it? It's in November, you know, et cetera. And that's why I think, you know, to Mike's point, in the next month, as we really were ramping up to that next level, making those closing arguments, but really less of a persuasion and more of a GOTV, and making sure people know your ballot has arrived, get it in today. Make sure that you're voting by September 14th. I think you're really going to see that. And I think what's going to happen is we're also then going to see a similar trend line in the polls where, you know, the gap widens and it gets back to where what we saw in sort of early polling where, you know, I'm not saying he's going to run away with it, but he should be do, you know, pretty well in terms of defeating the recall. I do think that, you know, some of these polls that came out, the timing was good in a sense because it reminded everybody that we really need to buckle down and take this seriously, and, you know, not just sort of dismiss this as something that's, you know, a bunch of sort of crazies that put on the ballot, but that, you know, it is a possibility that the governor could be recalled. So therefore, let's ramp up our phone banking and make sure the Democrats know, you know, how to turn, you know, that they're looking for their ballot, they're turning in quickly, they're going to the early voting places, things like that, which gives them, because of the vote by mail, a month to GOTV. You know, back in 2003, 70% of the vote was in person. If that was the case here, I think that it would be a much closer race and would be much more challenging. You know, like we saw in the November presidential election. So you saw in these states where traditionally, especially in California, Republicans were the one who are voting by mail and voting early, and Democrats were the ones that are voting on the polling place day, right? And so you'd see a Republican may be ahead, you know, in the first vote, but then all night votes would trickle in as late ballots arrive and as the polling place votes are counted, and then the Democrat would prevail. Whereas here, you know, the Democrats do have that opportunity to really GOTV folks for the next month. You know, the other aspect that, you know, in terms of what Mike was saying, is that you know, there are definitely Democrats out there that just your sort of average Democrats are that say, well, you know, I may not love Gavin Newsom, but I'm definitely going to vote against the recall because we can't have, you know, this sort of going back to what kind of a Trump person running the state. And, you know, he maybe hasn't done as many things as he would like. I think he would even admit that. But it's pretty hard to make even more of the sort of progress and the rubber meeting the road when you're dealing with a pandemic for 16 or 18 months, you know, of his first years in office. And so I think, you know, it'll be interesting to see that kind of argument made in the final stretch of, you know, here, look at the things we've done. In a sense, he's been a victim of his own success also in the very early stage of the pandemic, where he was really aggressive about closing things down. California, we didn't have what you saw in places like New York and others, where you saw, you know, the tragedy of so many folks dying from COVID. But you look now and what's happening in Texas, what's happening in Florida, and, you know, 4 teachers dying in one school district in Florida within 24 hours. The governor of Dallas fighting against local school districts who are trying to require mask mandates for children who can't even be vaccinated because they're under 12. You know, when you're looking around the country, again, maybe Gavin Newsom hasn't been able to do as much as he would like, but he's doing a night and day difference in terms of handling the pandemic compared to those types of states. And I think voters are really going to realize that. They just need to be sort of reminded about it so that they're motivated to come out and vote for the election.
Currently, there's a big funding discrepancy between the Newsom campaign and any of the individual candidates who are running, I guess you could say, against him. Let's say that as money maybe starts to flow to one candidate who might look stronger in the polls, are there any vulnerabilities you think that candidate could take advantage of to try to broaden that pool, to try to go beyond maybe, I think you both identified sort of an angry pool or a pool that just doesn't like him, but that's not large enough to actually recall him, but that could maybe start to resonate beyond that? And I'll start with you, Mike.
Well, look, I think the Republicans actually did something tactically very smart in the past couple of weeks, which was they refused to endorse a candidate. The reason why they didn't endorse a candidate or back one is because that would have immediately allowed for a target to be made and for Gavin Newsom to create a contrasting position against one person. As long as it remains a referendum on Gavin Newsom, the recall potential remains real because people are not happy with the way that the state is going. The question is, can he fend that off? Can he point out to the kind of a Republican boogeyman and say Trump enough times that it's going to stick in the minds of Democratic voters and bring them home? Their bet is yes, that they can. And as long as they have the resources to do that, which they do, and the time to do that, which it's getting thin, but they still do have the time to do it, then again, his chances still look pretty good. So my strong suspicion is that that's where they're heading. It would take an extraordinary amount of money. And I'm also a big believer that money doesn't necessarily make a big difference in these executive races. The narrative is largely set.
Okay.
It doesn't matter how many commercials I watch to change my mind about these things. We're in a time where mobilization is much more important than persuasion. You're not going to change people's minds. The question is your base voter going to show up and actually vote? So that's where resources really matter. It's why Gavin Newsom has corralled and saved resources as much as he has. They're going to spend this late. They're going to spend it overwhelming, and they're going to make a big push to make sure that the Democratic base turns out. And if it does, they're banking that that's going to be enough to keep him governor for the next year before the next election.
Okay, Josh.
Yeah, absolutely. And just looking back at 2003. The world was very different. Most people were watching television on 4 channels. So you could run big TV ads and capture large swaths of the electorate in minimal places. Whereas now there's so many more people streaming, unplugged, on social media, getting their information from so many different places that even if they did come up with a whole bunch of money, I think it would be the Republicans, or any specific candidate, I think it would be really tough because at the end of the day, what 2003 turned out to be was not only a referendum of Gray Davis, but a choice between Gray Davis and Arnold Schwarzenegger for a lot of people. Schwarzenegger also was able to, I think, turn people out to vote who were not sort of traditional, high propensity voters,
Right.
like what we saw with Trump, frankly. And I think that a number of congressional seats that were lost in 2020 were because Trump has this ability to bring out voters who don't normally vote. They're not usually really involved in their society, their school district, or volunteering. They're not like realtors who are active members of their community. Now, obviously, there's a lot of Trump supporters who also are active in their community. I'm just saying that he had this ability to bring out folks who were not normal voters, and Schwarzenegger was able to do that. And I don't see anybody on this recall ballot that's really able to do that. I think that's also in part why, the Republican Party poobahs were basically trying to encourage as many different types of Republicans to come out and vote as possible because they didn't have any one good candidate. So they thought, well, maybe if we have 1,000 of them and they each bring out, their friends and family, that'll be enough. But they're going to be a few million short, with that kind of a strategy at the end of the day.
Right. So it sounds like very much so that none of the candidates themselves, none of those candidates who are running are that type of candidate that you described that might have that appeal to bring out maybe the hidden voter or who resonate beyond the base, the Republican base.
Yeah, certainly not anybody who's on the ballot.
Correct. That's right.
And John Cox, this guy is a loser who lost 10 or 11 elections in Illinois, came out here, lost a few elections here, and then became the Republican Party candidate against Newsom and got trounced. So, maybe he's got a little bit of a base, but it's certainly a very low high watermark, as Mike mentioned before. And, the person who I thought maybe could have caught steam and turned it into maybe more of a real race, Kevin Faulconer, if he could make an argument of like, hey, I'm a mayor, I was able to work with Democrats and Republicans to manage a city, and, we'd have common sense solutions, that type of thing. But as we see so often with Republican candidates, it's a race to see who can go farthest to the right. And that is going to be a losing path in California for many years to come.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned Faulconer because I thought the same thing, but I think he doesn't excite the base. What do you think about that, Mike?
I don't think he excites the base at all. I think the fascinating thing about Kevin Faulconer is he spent so many years of his tenure as mayor of San Diego, largely successfully, not being a Trump supporter. But then once the opportunity came to run for governor, especially with the recall election, suddenly he became, a Trump supporter because he or his advisors felt they understood where the base was at. What's unfortunate about this story, and I think we're going to see how this plays out, is Kevin Faulconer may not even be the top Republican vote getter in this recall election. If he doesn't, then I think his career is essentially over.
Interesting.
And the great irony is, there is a roadmap for Republicans running in blue states to be quite successful. Larry Hogan in Maryland,
Right.
Baker in Massachusetts, Vermont even has a Republican governor. They all have one thing in common. They're all vocally anti-Trump. So even though the polling and the demographic base looks the same in state to state, showing that leadership quality, that independent streak that the mayor, Kevin Faulconer, showed during his tenure in San Diego, and then capitulating entirely on it to run for governor, I think will end up being one of the big mistakes of his career if he is not the top Republican vote getter. I'm not sure how he overcomes that.
Yeah, and Cox was the same way. He had criticized Trump repeatedly, and then
Didn't vote for him.
Didn't vote for him and admitted it repeatedly, and then running against Travis Allen in the primary, tried to get his buddies to get a tweet of support from Donald Trump, thinking that was his path forward. And maybe it was out of a Republican primary, but the person who's most Republican in a Republican primary is often the worst candidate in a general election, especially in California.
Okay, what should we be looking forward to in the next few weeks? I think you've touched on some of this, a big get out the vote effort, etc. But anything in particular, Mike?
Well, depending on how granular you want to get, I think what people like Josh and I will be looking for is actually the ballot returns, the actual numbers, to see when the Democratic base is going to show up. Is it going to show up early? Is it going to show up late? Is it going to show up at all? But watching the gap between the number of Republicans that turn in their ballot early and Democrats who turn in their ballot is going to tell us a lot about what's going to happen on Election Day. There's still going to be a lot that will be turned in the day of at ballot places, and that will be overwhelmingly a Democratic vote. But watching the energy and the enthusiasm is going to be a day-to-day activity. You don't learn anything by watching one day. You have to watch the multi-day trend. But those ballots are going to start coming in, the next couple of weeks, and as they do start to trickle in, it's going to tell us a heck of a lot about who's enthusiastic, who's not, and what the ultimate outcome of the race will probably look like.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Josh?
And it really is going to be fascinating to watch. One of the things that I'm really intrigued by is we saw, even in California, where Trump obviously was going to lose, we saw these dynamics, and we traditionally again see Republicans voting early, voting by mail, but because both the Democratic Party nationally was really pushing voters to vote by mail and vote by mail early, so you saw a lot of that in the media, and Biden really ran a very different type of Democratic campaign than normal, where it really wasn't focused on boots on the ground and getting voters out. It was all about vote by mail and mitigating COVID. And then on the flip side, then Republicans ran with it the opposite way and, basically wanted to make a political statement against COVID by showing up to vote and not voting by mail. So with the most recent election, that was the Republican Party and Republican voter MO. It'll be really interesting to see how many Republicans vote early, how many vote late. Even the ones that are super excited to skip on down to the polling place, we may not have a good measure of that because they very well may not want to vote by mail because of the sort of hangover of last time and feeling like, oh no, we vote in person now, or we go down to our polling place now. So I'm really curious about your thoughts on that and the targeting that you saw. I totally agree with Mike that we want to see how many Democratic votes are coming in early, where they're coming from. Areas like the Bay Area, which usually outperform Los Angeles, we're going to want to see those types of trends. We could very well get together again in 2 to 3 weeks and looking at that data, between Mike and myself, and give you some analysis and say it's over. But there very well could be, potentially a late Republican surge where it'll be interesting to see that if Democrats feel in the first week or two, oh, it's over because Republicans aren't voting like we thought they were going to, but maybe they actually will. They're just going to vote late and in person. I don't know, that'll be one of the interesting dynamics that I'm looking forward to assessing. And I'm really curious about your thoughts on, when do you think Republicans are going to vote? More early, late?
I've spent 30 years and many tens of millions of dollars trying to train Republicans to vote by absentee over 2 decades, and then Trump walks in and kind of tells them to do the exact opposite, and they followed Donald Trump. I don't know.
Don followed what he said, but not what he did, because he voted by mail himself.
Yeah, exactly.
Just like he got a vaccine himself, but tells everybody else not to do such things.
Right. The point is, it's very fluid, right? Is these voters will move and they will follow kind of directions when given directions to do that. Look, I think that Republicans will be voting early. I think that you're going to see a late Democratic surge because I'm a big believer that history is a pretty good guide. Mm-hmm. It's not always right, but it's a pretty damn good, gives us a pretty damn good roadmap of where things are going to be heading. And I think that Democrats tend to vote later. You look at the Latino vote specifically too, where you're seeing some squirreliness with some of the numbers there. Dollar to a donut, that Latino vote's going to come home the way that it has the past 30-year trend line. It will come in late. It will come in pretty significantly. I think that's going to be the trend line with most Democratic voters. And I think that you're going to see a late push with Democrats. We'll see where all that money goes that Gavin Newsom's got bankrolled. And I think that the math just gets more complicated for the challengers.
Finally, you also I think you both alluded to, and Mike, you in particular, that the Republican Party did not endorse a particular candidate, so there isn't sort of an endorsed candidate for the Republican Party. There are a number of Republican candidates running. Do you think Gavin Newsom will or should start identifying a candidate, or will he just keep it at this Democrats come out, or do you think he'll end up sort of focusing on a candidate, or would he be afraid of giving that candidate traction? What do you think that'll happen
I think, and again, that's a really good question, because we're all going to get the answer by just watching what the Gavin Newsom campaign does. We can kind of strategize right now, but I will guarantee you one thing. The answer to that question will be poll tested with tons of resources to figure out what the exact right recipe is going to be. So probably by the time that this is airing and your member realtors are listening to this, they'll be seeing ads with the answer to that question. My guess at this point in time is they will probably pick one person to start crystallizing in the minds of voters what the threat is. It will probably be the front runner. In all likelihood, it will be Larry Elder, because there's at least 20 years of opposition research files. There's a whole handful of Democrats right now, operatives, listening to every one of his talk radio shows that he's done over the past 20 years to find a whole range of issues where they can kind of open them up on, and that's what they're going to be doing. And my guess is that will probably be, the more bilateral the conflict is, the more red and blue, the more direct the contrast, the better it's going to be for Gavin Newsom. So rather than running against sort of this abstract Republican boogeyman, they're going to try and pinpoint an actual person and run against that person. That's just my
right. I agree. Who is a boogeyman? Larry Elder. So many of the things that he's put out have been completely crazy, that I think many of your average Republicans will think is very extreme and not something that they necessarily agree with, and certainly independents and more conservative Democrats. I think we're already starting to see a little bit of this in social media, and I've seen a few tweets where if you don't vote no on the recall, then you're going to have Larry Elder as governor. I don't know if that's the sort of message of the week kind of thing, or if we'll start to see that more in paid advertising. But I will say, one of the campaign aspects that Gavin Newsom and his campaign ran very successfully during the primary, during his primary, was, he basically ignored, for the most part, for most of the primary, the other Democratic candidates, and both Gavin and a significant IE went out and attacked Cox and basically said, do you want this type of person, and all of the sort of red meat that Democrats were going to respond to, or Gavin Newsom, and it kind of elevated him. He obviously had the benefit of being the lieutenant governor, so it was a natural play. But I think that looking at their playbook from the past and, some of these early cues, as Mike said, it'll be something really for your members to watch in the next week or two, as we start to see that in any kind of TV advertising, digital advertising, radio, that sort of thing, where if he really hits the gas on that, or if they shift. But I have a feeling that, as Mike said, I think that's a really good question, and one I hadn't thought of too much, but I do think that they very likely will go this elder path. It seems like they're doing that, and it seems like it'll probably be a winner for him just because elder is so flawed. And even the one ad that I've seen so far where elder is up on TV, you can't even really understand what he's saying, and it's kind of nonsensical, and it's certainly not something that's going to get a lot of non-conservatives excited about.
Okay, thanks, Josh. Mike, any final thoughts on?
No, I think just the main thing to think about is, staying involved, active, engaged in this as much as you can. It's a tough job that we put California voters through to constantly have things before them on the ballot, but it is incredibly important. The impact of this election is going to have a lot to do with the profession and the industry that realtors deal with day in and day out. Housing is obviously probably the number one issue.
Right.
It's going to continue to be regardless of who the governor is going to be. So, as tough as it's going to be over the next couple of weeks, watching sort of the ads come out, the mail coming out, and the candidates sparring, it's very important. So just make sure that you're engaged and stay tuned and make sure you vote.
Josh?
Absolutely. I think voting is going to be extremely important. Obviously, I think it's going to be best for the state. Even realtors who may have supported Donald Trump or maybe Republican. I think that at the end of the day, we want stability in California. We want business people, want to be able to bank on California having a stable economy and sort of predictable outcomes in terms of how local governments are going to run and things like this. And I think that Gavin Newsom is a real partner potentially for the realtors and for addressing these issues of housing and trying to get more affordability and opportunities of home ownership. And I think that that's a much better path forward than somebody who is probably just going to create chaos for a year and then be kicked out of office. And I think chaos is not good for the real estate market. I don't think it's good for neighborhoods. I think that it's good for everyone when we have good schools and safe neighborhoods. People can have a good job and afford a safe place to live. And I just feel like if the recall happens, that's just going to create complete chaos and turmoil and undermine all of those things that really benefit all of us.
Okay. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Josh. I really appreciate the insights. We will be, I think I will catch up with both of you to talk about early returns
Sure.
when we have a chance to get a sense of what's going on. Thank you for everybody listening to our first podcast. And please, everybody listening, remember to fill out your ballot and vote by September 14th. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Disclaimer. The purpose of this podcast, brought to you by the California Association of Realtors, C.A.R., is to provide general and educational information and opinions from a wide range of perspectives regarding politics, voting, elections, legislative issues, and more. The opinions, beliefs, and views expressed by guests or participants of this podcast are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions, beliefs, or views of C.A.R., its affiliates, their respective directors, officers, or employees. Reference to any individual or entity does not constitute an endorsement, recommendation, or any other position or opinion regarding that entity or individual by C.A.R. This podcast does not constitute professional advice or services of any kind. This podcast is available for private, non-commercial use only. You may not edit, modify, or redistribute this podcast.